Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Faith Seeking Wisdom podcast. The Faith Seeking Wisdom podcast is dedicated to the cultivation of learning and intellectual virtue through the testing of ideas and interviews with scholars who are actively in the field working on these on different topics. My name is Ethan, and today I'm interviewing Devin Dettman. Devin is a PhD student at Baylor University. Started in 2024. Before that, he completed a BA in philosophy and theology at the University of Notre Dame and an MA in philosophy at Western Michigan University. His philosophical interests focus on metaethics, moral psychology, and philosophy of religion. Outside of philosophy, he enjoys board games, weightlifting, live music, especially emo and punk shows, watching college football, and going to mass at St. Peter's, which we're smiling about that because we were just having a conversation about a concert that he went to recently before we started. So, Devin, it's great to have you on.
Yeah, great to be here. Glad I can be consistent to my own brand.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, for the audience, Devin and I met each other last November at the Midwest Regional Society of Christian Philosophers Conference. He gave a really good paper on divine command theory, and so I wanted to reach out to him and help him get his work out there more in the public eye. So, Devin, so for context for the audience, Devin's works on divine command theory, and he focuses on Robert Adams's version of divine command theory and C. Stephen Evans's version of divine command theory. He also brings in some of his own contributions to that version of divine command theory via Iris Murdoch's Platonist moral philosophy, as well as some concepts in moral psychology and virtue theory. So, Devin, I'll just have you start by giving the audience like a brief overview of what divine command theory is within metaethics, and then you can kind of, I'll just let you take the ball and roll from there when it comes to Adams, Evans, Iris Murdoch, and your own work.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. One of the reasons I find divine command theory so exciting to study is because it encompasses such a broad range of theories. Like there are so many different approaches to ethics and metaethics that you could plausibly call divine command theory. So any definition I give is going to fail to capture some and focus more on others, but that's kind of the fun of it. And in some ways, it's really like talking about divine command theory is a Rorschach test for just how you approach the relationship between God and ethics. But at the broadest possible level, divine command theory can be understood as a theory that grounds the moral life in God. And then the more you specify what exactly that connection is and how it works, then you start to narrow down particular types of divine command theory. And there are different aspects of the moral life you could focus on as well. So the most popular way to approach divine command theory in analytic metaethics is to talk about the metaphysical grounding of moral obligations in God's commands.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can further specify why that's the case. Is it a matter of God's will generating these obligations, or is it a matter of God's will as it's communicated and only when it's communicated? And there are different reasons you can think that those commands would ground a moral obligation. Does it have to do with the structure of our nature? Does it have to do with the structure of the relationship to God and the structure of social relationships themselves? And then you can ask what makes that relationship to God special. And a lot of the work is done on obligations, and rightfully so. In metaethics and ethics generally, moral philosophers are very concerned with things like universal human rights, respect for human persons, and those processes of inquiry have generated a lot of good in the world. And so we're rightfully focused on those. But there's a lot of other aspects to the moral life too, beyond moral obligations, like the way that we understand and express those moral obligations in our practical life. And so some of the work that I do is focus more on that kind of like messy psychological stuff, not just what moral obligations are. How do we understand them? How do they become a part of our practical life? And does the way that we internalize them matter to the kinds of people we are and the kinds of lives that we lead? And that's so one of the reasons I find divine command theory so interesting is because it encompasses more than just an explanation of the metaphysical grounding of obligations. It encompasses a whole approach to the moral life that takes really seriously the question of what does it mean to have a relationship with a being like God, and how does that relationship play a key role for the divine command theorist, a foundational role in our moral lives, not just abstractly, but like psychologically, personally,
Mm.
affectively, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear you say that. I've been doing some work on epistemology recently and the epistemology of emotions, and even just personally
Yeah,
wrestling
great.
through how the affective life relates to the intellectual life, and how if my affective life is disordered, that disorders my intellectual life and things like that. So that's really just encouraging to hear you say that from the personal side of things. So and then also that was a really excellent overview. So thank you for that. But yeah, now maybe we can drill down into that moral psychology piece that you're talking about. If people like Robert Adams and Stephen Evans, who have broadly given Christian Platonic accounts of divine command theory that specify the relationship between God's goodness and the grounding of moral obligations in God, how do you then extend their accounts in your work on moral psychology and the moral life and through the influence of Iris Murdoch? Let me know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the reasons that I'm so interested in Robert Adams's work on metaethics, especially his older work, where he is subscribing to a like thoroughgoing Platonist theory of the good and grounding it in metaethics, um, and grounding a metaethical approach in that theory, which is, you know, not as common these days as it
Hmm.
used to be. And even, you know, post Aristotle, everybody sort of through the medieval period kind of left Plato's metaphysical system high and dry as a prefiguration of the nice, precise, systematic Aristotle. And you know, I like Aristotle too,
Yeah.
but it's really cool to to see a more Platonic theory of metaphysics and its meta-ethical implications worked out in the way that Robert Adams did. And one of the reasons it's cool is because it also gives a basis for comparing figures who also had Platonist tendencies, but might not be associated with divine command theory, like Iris Murdoch. So Iris Murdoch is, you know, in analytic philosophy, I would say the other big main Platonist moral philosopher, but there hasn't been as much as you might think written about the relationship between the kind of Platonism that Roberts puts forward, Robert Adams, sorry, in Baylor,
No,
there's a
no,
lot of
no.
Roberts in Christian
Oh yeah.
philosophy. So
Oh
we've
yeah.
been talking a lot about Robert Roberts and his
Yeah.
new book that he has coming out,
Yeah.
which is moral psychology, very exciting. So
Hmm.
it's hard to keep the and I so at Notre Dame, which is where I did my undergrad, Robert Audi was a professor of mine. So
Yep.
you have to keep
Yep.
all of the Roberts straight.
There's
So
far
Robert
too many
Adams,
Roberts. Yeah, 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 yeah.
it's great. No, we're blessed with an abundance of brilliant Roberts in Christian philosophy.
Yes, we
So
are.
Robert Adams. Um, there hasn't been as much written as you might think comparing his approach to Platonist moral philosophy with Murdoch's approach to Platonist moral philosophy. And one of the reasons I think this is a really rich thing to study and consider is because of how much Iris Murdoch talks about the moral psychology elements that I was talking about, what it means to do interior work in light of your beliefs about the grounding of obligation and the direction of your attention and where it ought to be placed and those types of things. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in extending the kind of Platonism of Robert Adams, who writes so systematically and so precisely about, you know, the thing I was talking about earlier, the metaphysical relationship between God's nature, moral obligations, how it's mediated, in his view, through the structure of social obligations, where C. Stephen Evans, he takes more of a natural law approach to divine command theory, still with Adams grounding a theory of the right in the theory of the good that has to do primarily with our relationships to God. But Evans writes a lot more about how that relationship is understood through a function of the structure of our nature rather than the other way around. So that's a quick tangent. But Murdoch writes a lot about, again, the inner moral life. What does it mean to treat attention to God as the fundamental moral act?
Mm.
And why, what would even mean psychologically speaking, and then morally, to take that as the basis and center of your moral life, rendering obedience to God. And so I have this kind of like, I don't, maybe it's not that. I think it's, if it's not controversial, it's at least novel. I read Iris Murdoch as the divine command theorist for this reason, because she talks in ways that are so similar to what Robert Adams writes about the moral life and how the real basement of morality is paying attention to the moral importance of what is absolutely good. And Iris Murdoch even writes a lot about the idea of obedience to the good, obedience to the Platonic good, which is a relational concept.
Hmm.
And she makes a lot about that. And she writes, even though she herself was broadly an atheist, but was very interested in Christianity and was in and out of the Christian tradition throughout her life. She was very interested in religious concepts that paid attention to this moral dimension of the purification of our inner life through things like prayer and meditation and adoration and obedience to a transcendent reality in a way that the meta ethics that was going on at her time, and indeed even the ethical theory that was going on at the time, and the psychological theory, across the board, in moral philosophy was very behaviorist, logical
Hmm.
positivist, and she was inspired by the way that religion was attending and religious theories were attending to this dimension of the inner life that the moral philosophy surrounding her at Oxford and Cambridge was ignoring and indeed denying existed.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
sort of my like angle on divine command theory as I see it, is trying to draw out some of the implications. Okay, we have these really amazing, interesting, systematic theories of the, metaphysical, technical like relationship between God's nature and moral obligations. But what does that actually mean in terms of how our inner life ought to be structured if that relationship is really true?
Mm. That's awesome. So maybe we can then transition into some of those implications. Devin gave a great paper, as I mentioned earlier, on that very topic at the Midwest Regional Society of Christian Philosophers conference last year. So maybe you could transition into talking about some of those implications that you think divine command theory has for our moral psychology and the way that we structure our inner life and rendering obedience to God.
Yeah, so one of the issues that has generated a lot of discussion in the contemporary literature on divine command theory is the question of like what place do non-believers have if in the moral life if divine command theory is true. And basically all of the major proponents of divine command theory, whether it's Robert Adams or Stephen Evans, want to say that obligations still apply to non-believers. They don't want to make um the moral life, a believers only kind of clubhouse.
Hmm.
But then it gets somewhat complicated if the idea is, well, the grounding moral value that explains moral obligations is the importance of the relationship that we have to a transcendent personal reality, which could encompass, not just Christianity, but a number of different religious traditions. But still, seems at first glance to be confined to something like explicit avowed religious belief. What to make then of people who deny that such an entity exists and deny that there is a relationship of any importance to be found in those kinds of religious practices that ground the psychological life of a practicing believer of many different kinds of stripes. And so everyone is one to say, well, there are ways that the commands of God covertly or indirectly reach the non-believer. And there are ways that the non-believer can indirectly value having a relationship with God by valuing the components of the moral life and explaining them some other way. So part of the idea is that, well, God's commands and God's action in history, this is especially true if you subscribe to a particular religious tradition like Christianity, has kind of suffused culture. And so the reality of God, but even more broadly, if you just think, well, the reality of God as it is manifest to the people who believe in God across different religious traditions and seek this kind of purification of their inner life that makes them more responsive to God's commands and the principles that are a part of it, which is where we get our moral obligations and moral principles, is the principles that we have to follow in order to flourish in our relationship with God, which involves how we treat others. because that's something God desires for our life on this account, even across religious traditions, even covertly, is how the account runs. That suffuses the culture, and so non-believers pick up these principles. Don't lie, don't steal, support the needy, um, try to improve yourself and use your capacities and strengths to support your community. Those kinds of, basic moral principles that pop up in a lot of different cultures. They get to the non-believer who sees them as attractive and sees them as important and sees them as something binding, but doesn't have the explanation of why. And so the standard story or the standard reply to the non-believer objection, this is what Eric Weilenberg calls it, is to say, oh, well, they just indirectly reach them. And as long as the non-believers are following what in fact are the moral principles, and they in fact see them as important and authoritative, it doesn't matter that they don't have what the divine command theorists would consider the right story about why those principles are authoritative. They count as bound and obligated. And when they fulfill those principles, when they follow those principles, they deserve credit and can still have moral virtue even without explicitly valuing our relationship with God. And so I think as far as the story about how obligations reach non-believers, broadly speaking, that makes good sense to me. Um, but one of the things that I found interesting that I wanted to develop in my own work was this question of the latter part, the moral worth, moral credit, moral virtue part, because a lot of the virtue literature makes a big deal about not just doing the right thing, like not just following moral principles, but following them for doing the right thing for the right reasons,
Yep.
where that's conventionally understood or philosophically understood on many accounts to involve doing the right things for the reasons making it right.
Yep.
And
Yep.
now on some accounts, that just means doing the right thing because you have the moral principle internalized. So giving to charity because you know that it's a moral principle to use your resources, to some degree, and you can debate precisely how much, but to some degree to support those who are less fortunate than yourselves. Doing the right thing for the right reasons means knowing that's a principle, doing it because of the principle, and not doing it to impress your crush or to impress your boss or to impress onlookers or whatever. And so if you have the principle and that principle explains your action, that's sufficient on some accounts. But then I kind of one of the other broader things I'm interested in is in trying to bridge the gap between meta ethics and first order ethics and moral psychology more broadly, not just with divine command theory, but to push literature to get more precise on how moral psychology explains the relationship between meta ethics and first order ethics, not just in a technical abstract way, although that's important, but like how does that relationship actually show up in our inner life? So one of the things that I point out is, okay, that's great if we have these moral principles, if I'm a non-believer and I have, supposing that moral principles are in fact authoritative because of our relationship with God, and supposing I'm a non-believer who covertly has internalized these moral principles. God's not playing any role in why I think this is important, is not playing any explicit role psychologically for me in why I think this principle is binding and authoritative, or why I desire to fulfill it in my actions. So supposing I have this principle, like help others, and I do in fact help others. Um, but what's valuable to me about following that principle, again, in my own psychology, it has nothing to do with any value that I am placing in a relationship with the transcendent, personal, perfect being. Um, it has to do with whatever reasons I take myself to have for adopting that principle, if I've reflected on it at all. So
Hmm.
if I've reflected on it, again, you'll see lots of secular accounts of why moral principles are worth following. It might be a matter of my own authenticity. I talk a lot about the ethics of authenticity, that for a lot of secular moral philosophers, by no means all of them, but for a lot of them, And again, is kind of core to the ethics that Iris Murdoch was surrounded with, which is why she's such an interesting figure to consider in light of this discussion. Ethics is a matter of authenticity. Like it's about systematizing my deepest emotional intuitions because I am the source of moral authority, me and my will and its structure as it relates to other wills. So that's a kind of neo-Kantian
Hmm.
existentialist picture of ethics. One of the things that I think is absolutely brilliant about Murdoch's philosophy is she calls neo-Kantianism a form of existentialism, which I think is exactly right and doesn't
Wow.
get discussed enough. But it's all about the will as the source of authority, the personal individual will. And I have other work where I talk about and complicate the picture of, okay, I think that's a good read on how some positivists and constructivists picked up Kant's theory, but might not have been Kant's actual moral theory himself. And I have a
Hmm.
paper where I actually argue that Murdoch and Kant had very similar pictures of ethics, despite appearances, but that's a story for another day. But part of the idea is, well, if my moral psychology is built on this idea that I am the source of moral authority, or my deep self, my rational will, my idealized self, but still
Yeah.
myself,
Yep.
that's the source of moral authority, and the principles derived from the structure of my own will or my own self, even if some in some idealized state, then that's just not living the moral life fundamentally as a matter of rendering obedience to God.
Hmm.
And so I say, from the perspective of the divine command theorist, there is still a lot to admire in somebody who picks up the right moral principles, has a very inchoate and vague sense of their importance, of the importance of those principles, and cares about doing some kind of interior work to make one's moral life more coherent and consistent. That's very demanding. It's a very impressive project. And so one of the things I think is that there is some virtue there. But if somebody organizes their entire moral life around something that is not, in fact, the source of moral value, that is a real problem.
Hmm.
And that's a point that I talk about in relationship to divine command theory, but I think is a broader metaethical point. So suppose that Aristotelian naturalism is true and the moral life really is grounded in eudaimonia, but you don't believe in the human telos. You don't think there is some objective state called eudaimonia. You just, again, pick up, but suppose you live in a culture that is suffused with people who do, and you get this vague idea of happiness that's not clear, but it's related to you enough that you can pick up some of these moral principles. But again, it's just a matter of, the authority of your will. You don't think there's any objective state of happiness that you have to reach or that you're beholden to. I would say like there's something off there. Again, not to say
Hmm.
that there's a lot to admire, but there's something missing in that person's character and moral psychology that is disorganized and destabilized by not just the lack of a vision of what your moral life is and is for, but the denial that the thing that is actually organizing it is organizing it, the denial that that exists, and a psychological push away from it, and a lack of attention to it. Because one of the things Iris Murdoch stresses is the importance of how our moral life psychologically, like what makes our moral life more pure, more perfect, and more integrated around the true moral principles, is determined by the objects of our attention.
Hmm.
And so part of what it means on her system, which is also, a very different system from the way philosophy of action normally gets discussed, because it still to this day it normally gets discussed in a kind of positivistic frame that is focused on just again the metaphysical relationship between inner states and outer behaviors, not
Hmm.
focused as much on purely interior work. But for Murdoch, the central moral activity is what do you attend to and how do you let that object of your attention striking you from without organize your inner life. And so if we understand divine command theory in that light, then it's not just about understanding how God's nature gets us to derive functionally linguistically these moral obligations. It's about, well, how do we direct our attention so that we internalize these principles in the proper way, not
Hmm.
just follow them in whatever kind of psychological construction, happens to fall, but in a particular way that is, I describe as endlessly open to the reality of God, manifesting in our lives through these various means. And so for the non-believer who's not, again, like seeking God as the object of their attention in all of these areas of their life. So if they've got this inchoate sense in one, such that they have these moral principles, I mean, that's something, that's not nothing, that's significant and that deserves credit. But part of what I say, part of the like interesting bits about divine command theory is that, well, to say that the moral life is about our relationship with God is not just to find one vector to some of the moral principles, but it's about to live one's life in consistent openness and obedience to all of the ways that God's relationship is making new demands and is finding you in new ways and being psychologically open and responsive to that, and then expressing that in action. So the psychological priority of this endless openness to a transcendent being that I'll never fully understand, the way that I can have a deeper understanding of myself in a formal sense than the formal reality of God. That's like really important to the structure of
Mhm.
what divine command theory is, as I see it. And it's the kind of thing that is, if it's not missing, it's incomplete in the psychology of the non-believer. Now, it's also missing and incomplete in all of our
Yep.
psychologies, which is part of the point, that we never arrive at an exhaustive concept of God. So there's still like a lot of moral parity, according to this argument, between the non-believer and the believer. Like we all have these incomplete um, concepts of God that we're not ever going to formally exhaust. But and that's always doing something for our interior life. Like I do think even non-believers who don't have that idea of God's formal inexhaustibility in their head still understand that the moral life is like in at least in practice bigger than they could ever exhaust through their reflection. But when you also have the understanding that it's not just the moral life isn't just hard to figure out, like you're never going to entirely encapsulate it. That changes the way psychologically you relate to these principles. Is again this endless openness, this endless humility. I call it an endless aspiration,
Mm.
which kind of combines a bunch of different Plato moral philosophy words. Iris Murdoch describes the moral life as an endless task. And Robert Adams doesn't use that language, but he talks about the importance of ongoing moral reintegration that combats moral idolatry. Moral
Mm.
idolatry, which is specifically this kind of settling on an exhaustive concept and thinking, okay, well, in practice, I'll never completely, you know, conform to my idealized self. But part of that idea is like, if I had enough time, I could.
Mm.
Like it's like there's so um there's a difference between struggling to reach an ideal that I've pretty much figured out and struggling to comprehend an ideal that I will never comprehend, this side of the eschaton. And so divine command theory adds that. It makes the moral life not just in practice inexhaustible and endless, but in principle, because it changes the entire orientation of your psychological life, is what I argue. And
Mm.
that's like an important part of understanding how this Platonist version of divine command theory, and there are other versions of divine command theory, but this is the reason I focused on the Platonist one, is because I argue people are missing, I think, in some of the moral philosophy discussions, that this is an entirely different approach to ethics. So that was a lot. I don't know if you have any,
No,
any questions or want clarification
that
on
was
any of that.
no,
I
that
get
was
very worked up and passionate about
I
this because I think it's really cool.
I I'm really glad that you did. I find the Christian Platonic vision captivating in a similar way that you do. So I was glad to hear you just go off on a long rant about it. It's great. Um, it almost sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the parallels I was noticing as you were talking is it seems like the unbeliever is very much in the situation of Romans 1, where he can perceive the divine nature through the things that have been made, and he can follow these basic moral principles. But because he doesn't have that relationship of love, where his loves are ordered to the highest end and loves God as his all in all, that changes the way that he relates to the moral life, especially if you're a kind of Kantian who thinks that these universal norms are impersonal and that duty plays the sole driving factor in what you ought to do. because then you very much could fall into a kind of legalism where you may not actually want to follow these principles, but your reason tells you that you have to, and so your affect and your reason are disjointed, and that makes your moral life almost kind of slavish, where you feel like you have to force yourself to follow these principles. Whereas on the Christian vision, and the way I hear you articulating the Christian Platonist divine command theory, it is the relationship of love with the transcendent good that then orders and shapes our entire inner life and leads us to strive for an ideal that is not impersonal but personal. And because God is incomprehensible, it's a personal relationship that's never ending, because we're never going to exhaustively understand God. It's always a kind of further up and further in, as C.S. Lewis likes to say in the last battle. Um,
Mhm. That's
Correct me if
exactly
I'm
right.
wrong. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So one of the other things that I'm really interested in right now, my plan is to write my dissertation on love ethics and what it
Mm,
means to do an approach to ethics, or to take an approach to ethics theoretically, that's grounded centrally in a concept of love. Because love is really interesting in the history of moral philosophy. Um, because people think about it so differently. And especially in analytic philosophy these days, although more recently, like in the last 10, 20 years, it's been shifting. People are getting more interested in love. But love was thought as like a danger to ethics.
mhm.
Because the idea was, well, love is like partial. Love is the stuff that, like, like you love your brother, but that doesn't give anyone else reason to treat your brother well other than you. And if your love for your brother gives you and only you a reason to treat your brother well, then that's not a very morally important reason. Like morality is about what's like universal, like we all share. It's like the moral relationship to your brother. I don't know if you have a brother,
Yeah. Yeah.
but like hypothetically speaking,
Mhm.
is like the moral relationship to intimates is the one that anybody could take, not the one that's contingent on your like intimacy or affection or care for this other person. And so there are a lot of approaches to ethics, and this is how people sometimes read Kant, that say like, not ethics, like love, what we value personally is a matter of our like personal contingent inclinations. Like that's the stuff that ethics fights. That's what ethics constrains. That's why we need ethics, because like great, love your brother, just like within the bounds of ethics. And the stuff of ethics is like, no, but like what can we all like? What do we all have reason to like and do?
Mhm.
But one of the cool things about Murdoch's ethics is she kind of reframes the stuff of ethics in a way that's kind of Platonist, but she also says would have like scared Plato. She says that Plato and Kant were both afraid of the particular, but she
Mhm.
gives this radically particularist account of ethics that I think is actually more in line with what Kant was going for than what she thought in certain parts of her writing. But she talks about like the obligations, the principles, the stuff we can discover from the structure of the universe and our own practical reasoning, etc. The formal stuff, those are the conditions, and the stuff of ethics is the particular stuff, the people that we love and have relationships with. Um, and so rather than um, starting with the formal stuff and seeing what's left for you in your life, her approach to ethics is more like, well, let's start with what is most valuable to our existence, not just formally, but like psychologically, like in our own experience. So it's a kind of phenomenology, but it's a more analytic form of phenomenology that she's drawing from existentialism, that she's drawing from continental philosophy, but is very much like remixing it, I would say, in this way to say, well, let's start with the particular relationships that mean the most to us, and then derive principles about what is required to have a real relationship with this person and treat them according to the value that I can see they have. So starting with, kind of what we see in a broad sense as experience or
Mhm.
sense about the importance of the other, and then derive the structure from that, rather than starting with a structure and say, okay, now what's left for you to have permission to see?
Mm.
is kind of the like top-down approach, but the like particular to universal approach is more about saying, okay, yeah, these structures are good, and it's good that we can discover them and we can talk about, you know, the structure of human nature and the structure of metaphysical thought, and that's the kind of thing that again is universally accessible. But morality is not ultimately, on this approach that I think is really compelling. It's not actually about that. It's about the relationship that you have. And those are all the conditions that enable that relationship to flourish. And so again, this approach where it's like we've got all the principles, we've got all the scaffolding. So to um, adopt these principles, but not practice them in a way that is really building a flourishing relationship, like with God and with other people, is like to have all the scaffolding and no building, like in,
Mm.
in the scaffolding.
Yeah.
And that's where I think like moral psychology has so much to add to remind us, like, what are these principles for?
Yeah.
What are we supposed to do with these principles? Like, not just perform actions of any kind just for the sake of the principles. Like, we don't build the buildings for the sake of having scaffolding.
Hmm.
We have the scaffolding so that we can build these cathedrals. And so, to me, like, the cathedrals of the moral life are the relationships that we build with God and others. And it's important that we understand what that mean what it means to have a psychology that internalizes these principles in a way that really builds the morally grounding connections that it's supposed to. And again, at the theoretical level, I say that like, well, the way that secular theories describe the moral life, if that's what actually gets internalized, again, there's a lot to admire. But if divine command theory is true, then internalizing that means that there's something missing. There's not that clear vision of what we're building with these principles. But I think like psychologically, like on the ground, I mean, I have a lot of friends who are not like avowed believers, and don't formally have this theory of divine command theory in their head. But my idea is not that like what people need is like that like you have to read finite and infinite goods to be virtuous. Like that's
Yeah.
not my argument.
Yeah.
It's in some ways hard to capture because I'm trying to like draw more attention to the interior. But when I see my like friends who are non-believers and who are applying these moral principles, that they understand avowedly to be something like, well, people are really valuable and I do want to treat them well. And I think that there is something to these traditions, whether Christian explicitly or a number of other religious traditions, or even more secularized forms, like people who are very compelled, and I think rightfully so, by just even the secular idea of universal human rights and of justice. Um, they internalize that under the auspices of like, in my own experience with my friends, like what feels right to them. But there's also this searching and this churning that says, yeah, but like there's something beyond that. There's like something that I'm trying to see and build. So I think like as it actually gets played out on the ground, like a lot of the non-believers that I've interacted with as they approach the moral life, because it might sound like I'm trying to sideline non-believers from the moral life, but the way I see it, it's like I'm trying to give a theory that speaks to they're like searching for something beyond what can be captured by our concepts and are practicing morality more in line with what I'm describing than in this kind of like checklist reflection on the idealized self. What are the rules that I would follow if I were, perfectly rational, and then like how can I follow those rules as good as I can? And again, that's not like a terrible approach to ethics. They can get a lot right that way. But like I do think that people are engaging that more in a process of like trying to endlessly aspire for this like reality that's beyond them in which they want to participate, namely the reality of the infinite mystery of the others, and indeed this transcendent reality that seems to like hide behind the edifice that we use to like try to get at it, which is our moral principles and the way we derive them. Like I think so like the way I see this theory that I'm developing that I defend, I see it as actually capturing like more of the experience and the moral
Hmm.
experience, even of non-believers, and speaking to it than than sidelining them. Like
Yeah.
that's kind of how I don't know if that's helpful.
No, that is helpful. That's really helpful because
And it is biblical,
and it's a way
where
of
Paul defends,
yeah,
yeah,
it's a way
Paul
of
defends,
practicing what you
I preach a God that you've like sensed but never
yes
been shown.
what you worship is unknown, I make known to you. Yeah. Yeah, no,
That's
that's
right.
exactly right. Yeah. And I think that that's in some ways that's just practicing what you preach, because if your whole approach to ethics is this particularist relational approach, then trying to capture the relational experiences of how your unbelieving friends engage the moral life is actually a a way just of practicing what you preach, of treating others the way you want to be treated. You're trying to capture their experience, and then hopefully in doing that, you can point them towards the God who completes what they're searching for. So, no, I think that's really beautiful and that's helpful.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's also, I want to emphasize too that it's part of the way that I feel like, a lot to learn about, because a key part of this ethics, is the notion that even as a believer, you're supposed to have humility because you
mhm,
haven't formally exhausted, um, God. And that's an important, so part of what it means to have what I'm describing is like the appropriate moral psychology is to understand that I have a lot as a believer, even if supposing this theory is true, to learn about God through my non-believing friends and non-believing neighbors and non-believing community members, that God is endlessly manifesting in these relationships that we have with people. And so, again, like what this theory would entail is precisely that you ought to pay like a lot of close attention to your non-believing friends and neighbors to learn about what is admirable in their lives, in their lives, and how God is like revealing new moral truths through their like search, whether it's about or not.
yeah, that's helpful. Um, well, Devin, I don't think I have any other questions for you. It was just a joy to get to listen to you talk about this, and um, yeah, just very grateful for you coming on and sharing with us what you've been thinking about and researching, and really appreciate the way that you're integrating the theoretical with the personal. So um, we'll have to talk again soon, but yeah. So where can people find your work if they want to read more of what you've written?
Hot, nowhere yet. This is like the
Nowhere yet.
first time a lot of this is getting out there. So yeah, I in a lot of ways I'm more of an aspiring expert myself than an expert on these sorts of things, but I've got papers that are under review, so hopefully if you just keyword search Robert Adams and Iris Murdoch and stuff, there'll be stuff soon on Phil papers and in journals, but that's a matter of what the reviewers think of all of these ideas. That's beyond
Yes.
me. I am beholden and obedient to the peer review process.
Yes, I understand. I have faced those similar boats as well. So, well, we'll expectantly wait then, the peer review process. So, all right. Well, thank you, Devin.